All right, welcome into Surviving Paradise, the ex-Jehovah's Witness podcast that takes a deeper look at the self-proclaimed spiritual paradise of Jehovah's Witnesses. Thanks for coming and showing up for another week of this thing. I am your host, Stacy Bauman, and I have to tell you, I've been working up to this episode. I got a sneaking suspicion just based on how I feel about it that I'm not alone. This is going to be one of those subjects that is a bit polarizing for Jehovah's Witnesses and, of course, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as those of us that are so mentally diseased for figuring out this cult. But nonetheless, this one's loaded. This is going to be a big one. And so we're going to unpack this the best way we can. Bear with me, because I think that anyone who might have stumbled on this podcast or is purposely showing up here, which I deeply, deeply appreciate, I might add, is going to have a lot to think about and say about this particular subject. And God, here we go. Here we go, people. In my time as a Jehovah's Witness, and certainly as an elder, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses is truly obsessed, in my mind, my observations, again, from my view, my seat. The governing body is obsessed with truly two subjects that they continue to beat the drum on. They continue to pump out millions and millions of printed page. They've got carts, they've got a digital presence, they got a TV studio, and for some odd reason, sarcasm mine, they seem to always come around to these two subjects. The first one is they just love to bash all other religions. I mean, they will spend countless hours, months, years bashing every other religion and how awful they are. I used to laugh at public talks, my public talk outlines, in which the first 15-minute chunk of the outline was spent bashing everybody else. It was a very strange introduction, even at that time for me. I thought, I don't remember Jesus doing this. Don't remember him, doing a 15-minute stand-up on why everybody else is so evil and we're the right religion, so to speak. But the second subject is where we are going to venture this week in Surviving Paradise. And if you survived these spiritual gems, and I suspect some did without scars, many did with scars, there's more than likely going to be lots of opinions on this thing. And that second subject and where we are going this week, are you ready? I feel like there should be dramatic music. We're going to talk about sex. That's right. The time has come. If you're at all interested or associated with Jehovah's Witnesses, I mean, come on. You knew this subject was coming, and so did I. I had to work up to it. Not because I'm afraid of it or anything of that nature, but because there's just so many things to discuss on this one subject. Jehovah's Witnesses, or should I say really the governing body, as well as all leadership before the governing body, which, if you're a Jehovah's Witness listening, didn't really come about till 1971, 72. Before that, it was mostly presidents going back several decades. And then, of course, there was groups where they raised hands and voted on things when they were the Bible students. But Jehovah's Witnesses, or more specifically, the governing body or leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses, are straight up obsessed with sex. They are obsessed with it. And let's be honest, sex is a polarizing subject because maybe in 100 years from now, humankind will be like, what? But I don't even think that's true. I think it's mostly Western. I think if you go to other countries, sex, sexuality, nudity, those things are like, it's who we are as people. But in the West, with the puritanical beliefs and the evangelistic beliefs and all sorts of other words you could tack onto this thing, sex is a polarizing subject. People get weird about it. People get uncomfortable about it. And nowhere is that more true than Jehovah's Witnesses. And the governing body is flat out obsessed with it. And I'm going to show you a few reasons why I say that. But before we do, I want to give a trigger warning or just a warning in general. It is very likely going to take many hours, AKA many episodes, to examine Jehovah's Witnesses and the governing body's obsession with sex and all things sexual. May take several episodes, so brace yourself for that. And this is your chance to run back out the door and turn this off. And an additional warning, to get through this subject, I'm going to do my very best to keep it classy, to keep it mature. Somewhat. I'm still a big dumb guy after all. But just a warning that if you're easily triggered, it's coming. There's going to be, or you should be rather, on the lookout for humor, some puns, some play on words, maybe some borderline immaturity on my part. It is what it is. That's just the nature of this subject of sex and sexuality. Do I think personally it should be? No, not in the least. I truly don't. And I'll get into that. But many people are still uncomfortable with this because of the way they were raised or the way they think about that. And this episode and any subject matter that contains sexual information or a look at the sexual beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses is never meant to offend. It is never meant to judge someone else's sexual proclivities or what they prefer, or any of the above, anything that falls in that bucket. It is never meant that way. It's never meant to be offensive. But I recognize as a man in his 50s that this is one of those subjects that a lot of people are very uncomfortable with. And I've raised my son and some stepkids with the belief that we can talk about absolutely anything. Dinner table is open forum. It's not something that I think needs to be taboo. I don't think that it needs to be kept in the closet or hidden under something. I think, hey, let's talk about it. It's part of the human experience. So, trigger warning. We may have to do several episodes because literally Jehovah's Witnesses have a rule for every form of human touch you can come up with. And as we'll find, not even touching. And I'm not kidding. But there is going to be humor. There's going to be sarcasm. There's going to be, I guess you could say, maybe some slight immaturity. I'm just going to throw it out there and let you be the judge. So if this is something that is uncomfortable for you, be warned. We're going to talk about sex. And I feel like there should have been music or, popped in one of those top 40 songs from the 80s or 90s right here at a soundtrack to this. But here we go. We're going to dive in. All puns intended. So as we look at this subject, keep in mind that everything they counsel on, and maybe I should say almost everything, I guess that's fair. Almost everything Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body, and by extension, circuit overseers, district overseers, and congregation elders counsel on, almost always leads back to sex. Almost always. If you're being counseled on the way you dress, or the way you groom, or your makeup, or the height of your blouse, or the slit in your skirt, yeah, you can see a lot of it focuses on women, big shocker, or your hairstyle, or even smiling at a brother, or giving him too much attention, or quote unquote leading him on, it all leads back to sex in the minds of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's all going to lead back to some disastrous consequence where clothes hit the floor and everyone gets busy. That's just the way their minds think. And it's very, very easy to see this. They are constantly wanting information on your sexuality or what you think about sex. And if you don't believe that, take a look at some of the pillars or cornerstones of this religion/cult in reality. Take a look at some of these cornerstones and the type of things you're asked or required to reveal about your sexuality or your desire for sex, or God forbid, your experience with sex, take a look. Let's consider a couple. Baptism. When you go through those baptism questions, guess what? There's a whole section asking you if you've been doing naughty things. They want to know exactly what's your background or if you're currently practicing sexual things. And I'm not talking about even with another person. Masturbation is a big subject in this organization. We'll get into it in another episode. But during the baptism process, when they're going through the questions with you, they want to know. They want to know about your sexual history, or if you're currently involved in sex, or when's the last time you had sex or did something sexual. True. All true, people. I've been through the questions with dozens of people. Let's go to the next cornerstone or / pillar of their organization, marriage. If you want to get married in the Kingdom Hall, and again, I want to add an asterisk to this because maybe this has changed. I didn't take the time to research this. I haven't been an elder for 13, 14 years. But in my time as an elder, I married several people. And part of the process is you have to approach the body of elders if you want to use the Kingdom Hall. And literally, you could bypass anything. Are you financially responsible? Do you have a place to live? How do your parents feel about that? Nah, none of that matters. You know what we asked this young couple in the B school? We want to know if they've been touching each other in private places, if they've had sex. It's the truth. You literally sit down grown adults, and that's debatable considering how young some of us were when we got married, and you ask them, have you guys been doing anything naughty? Has he touched you there? Has she touched you here? True story. And let me tell you what, in terms of marriage and using the Kingdom Hall, if you've done anything bad, you don't get married in the Kingdom Hall. You're out. And you will very often know couples that have done something bad among Jehovah's Witnesses or touched each other as consenting adults because they don't get married in the Kingdom Hall. And that's not universal, but it definitely raises an eyebrow or two, like, they're getting married at that hall or that winery or that rec center. That's odd. And immediately every Jehovah's Witness mind goes to, oh, they did something dirty. Not kidding. The same could be true on, let's jump into another pillar or cornerstone, pioneering. When you go through an application process to be a pioneer, which means slave labor, you're going to be pitching their books and literature at the door. In my time, it was for 90 or 100 hours a month. One of the first things and only things the elders want to ask you is, have you been doing anything sexual? Have you touched anybody anywhere? Do you touch yourself? All of those things come into play in that process. Take it to another pillar, a cornerstone of this religion. If you are going to be appointed as a ministerial servant or a congregation elder, you will be yanked into this back school after they have agreed you're a good candidate. Remember, there's no God magic involved in these appointments, as can be seen from lots of problems. But they will pull you back into the B school and they will ask you, and I quote, I remember it like yesterday, is there anything, hint, hint, wink, wink, preventing you from taking this position of elder or ministerial servant? And let me tell you, if you're going to put a gun to the head of the guys asking that question and ask them what they're getting at, it's almost always sexual. Now, granted, they could have smoked a cigarette or they could be, stealing or lying. But listen, it's almost always basically, if it was worded more appropriately, hey, you're going to be an elder or ministerial servant, so we got two things for you here. The one big one now is, of course, having to do with child abuse and anything along those lines. But the other is almost always, where are you on this sex thing? Have you been engaged or involved with anybody in sex? Have you touched anybody? Are you watching pornography? Those are the kinds of things the elders are looking for when they ask you that question, when they go to appoint you. And then one final example, one more pillar or cornerstone of this organization is, of course, Bethel. In my generation, it was Brooklyn Bethel. Of course, now it's Wallkill and upstate New York and the different properties up there. But if you haven't taken a look at the current Bethel application and what it takes when you decide you want to go there and give your life away and work for nothing, take a look at that thing. And guess what? They want to know where you are on this whole sex thing. Have you been doing it? Have you touched anybody? You touch yourself? You watch it? Anything and everything having to do with sexuality. They are absolutely obsessed with it. And might I add, on the Bethel application, they never ask things like, have you been gossiping? Have you ever stole something in your life? Do you like to smoke pot? Or better yet, do you overeat at dinner time? Nope. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. They only want to know where your naughty parts have been. That's it. They want to know. Further shedding light on the fact that they are absolutely obsessed with this subject of sexuality, of sex. And it's absolutely unbelievable because it laces almost everything. So many meetings, so much literature, you name it. And this has really only gotten worse, particularly, I would say, the last 15 years. It's become more intense because of the explosion and proliferation of porn. I know that at the last Kingdom Ministry School, when I was actually teaching the other elders, I was assigned a part there, that pornography was a really big deal. And you had men who'd been serving as elders and servants who had to come forward and confess that they like to look at naked people doing stuff. And I mean to tell you, it's still I guess it's a problem no matter where you stand on this issue of pornography among Jehovah's Witnesses, because there are plenty of men who are living in sexless marriages, and probably women, I just don't have that perspective as a man, who are living in sexless marriages watching this stuff. So almost everything points towards this issue of sex. And I will tell you that 90%, and I'm pulling a number out of my ear here, 90% of every judicial matter I ever handled, and I have lost track of how many there were. I was an elder for 11 years. 90% of those meetings were almost always of a sexual nature. Almost always. I have to actually take time to sit and think about those that weren't. And there was a couple, but there was almost always problems surrounding sex. And it wasn't just teenagers. It was grown adults. It was men in sexless marriages. It was those that were coming out as gay, that had been hiding it. All of these things. What people preferred sexually. And nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in the organization. In fact, in the updated Shepherd the Flock of God book, sex and all things sexual has almost 7 pages devoted to varying degrees of touching, including momentary or accidental brushes with breasts, and even texting on your phone. You can literally be hauled in front of a judicial committee for just thinking about sex, texting a photo, or watching it, whether it was on purpose or accidental. They literally have a Bethel video, a training video that you may or may not have seen online. It was called Pillowgate and had all these instructions for incoming Bethelites about sex, masturbation, homosexuality, all of these things. And in this video, one of the Bethel elders, Ralph Walls, says, you don't even need skin-to-skin contact to be guilty of fornication. While the video shows a man and a woman sitting close, talking and smiling at each other, clearly interested in each other romantically. What? What? Keep in mind as we explore this subject, not only in this episode, but in future episodes, that the whole universe is on fire. We're all doomed to death and destruction at any split second. Mass genocide globally. Kids are starving. People are dying of disease. The elderly are neglected. I could go down a long list of things that should be completely under the microscope of those that, of course, are reporting directly to Jesus Christ, right? And yet, they are taking the time to print, film, create videos, dramas, entire convention parts on all things sex. You don't even have to be touching skin to skin anymore to be a fornicator among Jehovah's Witnesses. What? 7 full pages in the Elder's Handbook, not available to the common Jehovah's Witness, where the elders can delve into every single solitary possibility of how two people touch and what we're going to do about it. Now, the irony is, compare that to drunkenness. Drunkenness is a massive problem among Jehovah's Witnesses. It's going to get looked at on this show. Drinking, over-drinking, alcohol, drunkenness, and all the terrible things that come with it, oftentimes spousal abuse and all sorts of ugly things. That subject in the Elder's Handbook gets a whopping 2 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs. 2. Sex gets 7 pages. Now listen, as we dig into this, I find myself, and oh my God, my Jehovah's Witness training leaning on me so hard right here. I find myself resisting the urge to do this entire subject of sex and Jehovah's Witnesses in a full-blown symposium format, aka district convention style. And the truth is, it kind of deserves that. So brace yourselves, because this subject is so absurd and filled with so many potholes. And when the laughter stops or the discomfort, deadly, horrible misinformation and destruction of families, people, and their view of something that's supposed to be beautiful, all courtesy of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Sex. Oh my God. Did he just say sex? So let's take a look at this subject as explained by those who were chosen by Jehovah God and his son Jesus in 1919. And incidentally, they've been commenting on this even before Jesus chose them. So as always, he apparently loved their view on this whole thing of sex. I'm going to go macro level on this subject in this episode just to start the conversation. We're going to jump into the deep end of the pool on Jehovah's Witnesses and sex. And I want to say before we even start that on a personal level, and again, I'm a man, so all my perspective will be somewhat from a male perspective, while also trying to show compassion and empathy for how a female may view sex, or even a homosexual or a lesbian or someone that has a same-sex partner, which will have its own episode, and God knows it more than deserves it. But I want to say that on a personal note, and this is strictly too much information sharing my personality as host of this podcast, sex is a beautiful thing. It's beautiful. It's normal. It's a wonderful part of life. And as a guy and a heterosexual male, women are beautiful creatures. I've stated that before, and that's the way I am in my 50s when the testosterone is starting to wane, folks. But nonetheless, sex is a beautiful part of the human experience. It's wonderful. But it isn't life itself. And isn't it interesting that almost every cult you encounter is obsessed with sex? Is that a coincidence? No, it is not a coincidence. Simply stated, it is not. Sex is a beautiful part of the human experience. It should be enjoyed. Sometimes it isn't that great, let's be honest. Or maybe two people aren't meant for each other and it just doesn't have the fireworks it should. But it is a beautiful part of life. But it is not life itself. It is not life and death. Although you could probably argue that because, the human race, it wouldn't be here without sex. So keeping that in mind, keeping my own viewpoint in mind, and recognizing it's from my perspective, let's jump in. Let's jump into this subject to the degree we can and try to figure out why Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly leadership, are so obsessed with sex. And I want to start for something that always made me somewhat uncomfortable. From a very young age, you are taught a scripture, at least I was. And that scripture is Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 3, where it says, quote, "The eyes of Jehovah are everywhere, watching both the bad and the good." End quote. Proverbs 15:3. Jehovah sees everything and he's always watching. Got that? So Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jehovah and his son Jesus, their king since 1914, can watch everything you do. And let's just call it like it is. That includes taking a peek into your bedroom while you may be thoroughly enjoying one another. And yeah, that might be a little uncomfortable, but that is in fact what they teach. And if you were raised a Jehovah's Witness, you know that scripture. Proverbs 15:3, Jehovah's eyes are everywhere. He's watching the bad and he's watching the good. And if you don't believe that, take a look at so many Bible references. Let's unpack two. And the first one is probably obvious. For reference that Jehovah is watching people do the naughty or get busy or whatever slang term you want to make love, take a look at David and Bathsheba. Jehovah was watching. Jehovah's watching. And then he, according to the account in the Bible, he whispered in Nathan's ear and said, "Hey, I need you to go talk to David. I noticed he was staring at Bathsheba taking a bath, and then he had her husband killed so he could pull her up to the room." Now, I don't want to unpack the story fully because there's some really disturbing controversy around this story. We'll do that another time. But the key here is that Jehovah's watching. He saw it all. He saw everything. And there are countless examples like this in the Bible. So as a Jehovah's Witness, you are taught and reminded that Jehovah's watching. So is Jesus. No word yet on the Judicial Committee for Lot, who I can't even make anything funny about this, got involved with his own daughters. Yes, had sexual relations with his two girls, his daughters. No word on that one yet. Not probably a small coincidence considering the trouble they're in. And let's take a look at another one. No word yet on why King Solomon had 700 wives, and 300 concubines. Because what man doesn't need 300 side pieces? What? I'm not going to get into the cultural aspects of what was going on during that time period or in the pages of the Bible. The Bible, inspired by God, he wanted to make sure we knew Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And never forget that Solomon is held up as the wisest man in the world by Jehovah's Witnesses. You even learn that as a young kid in the Bible Stories book, how wise Solomon was. Wise? Listen, I absolutely love you ladies, but I don't want to be married to 700. And I certainly don't need 300 mistresses on the side. It's mind-blowing. And hey, never mind those poor women, the wives or the concubines, who maybe, if you're doing the math in your head, and again, here's a peek into my brain, who maybe got a visit from Solomon once every 2+ years, and in the meantime weren't allowed to touch their own bodies. No. Or even have an enjoyable sex life twice every couple years. You see, you can see that it starts early. The ladies, women, females have no rights in Jehovah's world. They never did. It's always been the case, and it's still holding true today. Still, right down to this district convention, they're still taking pot shots at women. And what about Solomon? Listen, as I've stated, and here's the sarcasm, folks. As a middle-aged man, I'm looking at Solomon thinking, was he in the Marvel universe? Is he a superhero? What? As a male, I'm going to admit right here that I've thought long and hard, okay, pun intended, how a guy ruling the kingdom keeps track of all these partners. Does he have an Excel spreadsheet he references on who gets a piece of him next? Or if he averaged one woman a day, and keep in mind, that's a total of 1,000 females in his little black book. How was he able to do that without help from the modern marvels of male pharmaceuticals? I think you get what I'm getting at. I mean, how did he get up for all of this? Pun intended. I mean, being sensitive here, didn't he have any favorites? I'll tell you one thing that I got out of this, the account of Solomon on this issue of sexuality and 1,000 women in his life. I highly doubt he fell into the horrible sin of masturbation, which of course isn't even mentioned in the Bible. Look, the Bible starts an almost downhill slide on this issue of sexuality, and it goes right back to the beginning. But David and Bathsheba, Jehovah's always watching. Solomon has 1,000 women. Lots is called a man of faith, but he's with his daughters. What? Oh, the questions. Oh, the questions. And if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're learning this from a young age. This is stuff that's in the Bible stories book, or the stuff that the kids are exposed to. At least they were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But keeping all of this in mind, that Jehovah watches everything and he seems to approve of these other weird sexual scenarios, keep in mind Jehovah isn't alone. Apparently the angels watch everything we do. They're watching too, which is why these genderless creatures, always pictured as great-looking buff dudes with perfect beards, couldn't resist the beauty of human females. Now look, as a heterosexual male, I get it. Women are beautiful. We are not, guys. That's my opinion. Couldn't be that heterosexual males wrote the Bible, though, right? No way. No way. It raises a lot of questions, though, doesn't it? Do the good angels, the good guys who didn't get kicked out of heaven, do they still have access to our bedrooms in full high definition? Do they watch? Do they just have perfect control over those parts down south? Oh, wait, they don't even have parts down south. And by the way, Jehovah's watching, the angels are watching. How does all of this compare to modern day pornography? The questions. Never mind. Never mind the hypocrisy. Never mind the questions in the overactive mind of this male host. And I'm sure I wasn't alone. There was other people going, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Yeah, therapy's a good thing for overactive imaginations and thinkers. But as a kid and a teenager, and even as a grown man, I contemplated this for many reasons. Oddly, this never stopped me from getting involved in sex as a teenager. But as an adult, these are the kind of things that started to creep me out a little bit. The more time I put and thought I put to this subject of sexuality. Jehovah's always watching. He's approved of all these crazy sexual scenarios in the Bible, and the angels are always watching too. Wait, what? You talk about taboo and uncomfortable. I found myself wondering, why is this not on our minds when we're really making our move on someone special? I don't know. But I want to take a quick look back as this podcast is not only unpacking the reasons why they're sex obsessed, but also kind of injecting my own experience. And so for myself, I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, was raised around it. I was raised by a single mother, and it was a little looser than if a dad was at home, let's be honest. And that involved women, or girls, excuse me, teenage girls as a teenage boy. And let me just tell you something about being a teenager in the 1980s. And I think that no matter when you were a teenager, male or female, you will nod your head. And it's this: puberty is undefeated. Puberty is undefeated. It's coming. It's going to happen. You're going to get hit with a flood of hormones. No matter who or what you find attractive, it's going to manifest itself. It's undefeated. It's part of the human experience. Now, growing up in the 1980s, and I'm sure it's true, it was true when I was an elder dealing with teenagers, and it's certainly true with witnesses today. everything about sex was negative. Everything. Constant barrage of how bad sex was. Sexual repression, sexual guilt, sexual shame. Public talks, books, magazines, dramas, the convention parts. It was littered with things like STDs are the result of sex. Unwanted pregnancy comes with everything sex. Ruined relationships, friendships. Your marriage won't last if you have sex first. Even if you do get married, after you have sex, you'll always regret not saving it for yourself. And on and on and on it went. All things sex were considered to be absolutely negative by Jehovah's Witnesses. And when you're in the teenage years, you're getting just pelted with these messages. Now, even in the 1980s, as a teenager, as you're growing up, trying to figure out what your body's about and what you like, you're getting these messages, as I mentioned, just thrown at you left and right. And in my day, 3 times a week at least. And we heard I remember when I was 15, 16, we heard rumors about what positions were acceptable in Jehovah's eyes. And I want to give you a hint. Missionary wasn't just a full-time preacher in a foreign land. One of my favorite stories about sex as a teenager was that there was an elder that told his Bible study that he always took the time to say a prayer before enjoying time with his wife. And no, I'm not kidding. He'd say a prayer to Jehovah before he mauled his wife. Apparently, Jehovah was interested in his performance. His wife's opinion, of course, didn't matter, but Jehovah's did. And I remember hearing that thinking, wait a minute, threefold cord cannot be, does this constitute a threesome? What? It's insane. Yes, I'm making jokes, of course. But as a teenager, this is the kind of stuff that you're getting hit with by Jehovah's Witnesses, as blessed by the governing body, who, of course, have a direct line to Jesus Christ. Now, it may be hard for people today to believe this, and it's taken hindsight and years of life experience for myself, but we were a little confused in that time period. At least I was, and I know my buddies were, other brothers, so to speak, that I hung around with, at what really constituted sex. The truth is, we really didn't know. We had a general sketchy idea. And remember, this is 1980 to 1985. I'll target those 5 years. There are many of my generation during that time that thought anything short of intercourse was fair game. It wasn't a sin. Anything short of intercourse was okay, but don't you dare have intercourse. Now, I personally was fatherless, so there was a couple of, and they were very nice men, nice, mature brothers at that time who studied the youth book with me in the late 70s. And if you're new to this podcast or you're younger, youth book was a blood red color, and it is truly one of the most god-awful publications ever made by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York. And we'll get into its pages in a whole episode. But who remembers that awesome publication? Bright red and filled with all kinds of nuggets of wisdom on sex for an inexperienced teenage boy. Subject for another show. So, warning, I'm going to tell some real-world experiences and stories here. Now, in my time period in the early 80s, I ran around with a bunch of teenage brothers from other congregations, other kingdom halls, and we had what I only like to look back on and call a mock brotherhood. We had kind of our own pact where we looked out for each other, especially on getting in trouble. And of course, what did trouble mean? It really meant sex. Sex, or sometimes drinking. We drank and listened to metal. But we really believed, from my experience with those 5 or 6 guys, we talked about it many times, that there was some sort of imaginary line on this subject. Everything short of intercourse was, well, probably shouldn't be doing it, but at least it's not fornication, right? Most of us, or at one time or another, had girlfriends that were sisters in the congregation. And without getting graphic, teenage graphic, we would remind each other, as only teenage guys can, just how far we can go if we learned one of the guys was going to go meet his girlfriend. We would take pride in knowing where that line, that imaginary line, was sexually. only to learn that none of it mattered. I'll never forget the first time I was in front of a judicial committee as just a publisher, as a kid, only to learn that it was all fornication, all of it. Everything we were doing was as bad as it gets in a disfellowshipping offense. It was all fornication. So as teenage boys during the 80s, we would try to look out for each other. And I won't use the slang, gross things that teenage guys say, but let's just say we thought we were really doing a service to each other, only to find out, nope, the governing body says that's all bad stuff. So let's talk about that. Porneia. And if you have been around Jehovah's Witnesses, or you were one and you've left, oh yeah, I would like to think there's some word that rhymes with it we could use in code, but there isn't. It's a Greek word, porneia. Let's talk about porneia. Do you remember when you first heard that word? I'd love to hear from some of you folks. I'll tell you what, porneia and how it was defined gained special weight and gravity in the 70s and 80s. It just took on a complete life of its own, this word. And I don't even remember hearing it or contemplating what it all meant, as I just exposed and said about myself, until like the early 80s. What, huh? Porneia? I know what fornication is. I get it. Porneia, and what that umbrella did to Jehovah's Witnesses is truly staggering. And it really gained steam in the 70s and 80s. A lot of people that have been associated with the Witnesses really take a look at Nathan Knorr, who was then the president prior to the governing body arrangement, and the guys who came after him, as a guy that was especially sex obsessed, particularly railing against homosexuality. And there's rumors that we'll get into in another episode as to why that happened. He was also the guy that instituted disfellowshipping, interestingly enough. But let's look at porneia. So the definition and references of Greek words, and porneia is a Greek word, can only be made by a study of the context it's used in the New Testament, where the word occurs. That's the only way you can get a grasp on what porneia, what's that? But none of that's true when you're 8 special guys in upstate New York with a direct phone line to Jesus himself. The problem when you look at porneia and how they define it, yes, I'm being silly. Did Jesus stutter? Was there a bad phone line that day? How does this God magic work when giving info to guys like Tony Morris, who is seemingly incredibly interested in all things sex? If you base it on his talks at the conventions and on JW Broadcasting, that man is sex obsessed. That and alcohol. Imagine that. But you can only really get a grasp on what porneia means by looking at it in context in the New Testament. But again, not when you're the governing body. You rise above that. In the Watchtower literature from 1970 to 2022, the definition of the Greek word porneia has changed. I know. New light, old light. See a past episode. The reason for this is not the finds of new Greek manuscripts from ancient centuries, or some new revelation as to how the Greeks use the word porneia. No, the reason for why porneia has changed is because the governing body has decided that it changed. They simply got in a room, as is rumored on Wednesdays, took a vote, and decided that a Greek word, none of them being Greek, none of them being present for when the Bible was written, means something totally different. So from 1970 to 2022, porneia and fornication and sex, the whole definition around it has changed. In 1972, the understanding of porneia as a reason for divorce was limited to marital unfaithfulness, essentially sexual relations between a married man or woman and a person of the opposite sex. Okay? Seems pretty straightforward. I'm not personally an expert in Greek or in Koine Greek or in Greek manuscripts, so take this with a grain of salt. But the only way to understand the meaning of a word, and in this case porneia, is to look at it in context in the New Testament. Only the general meaning of sexual immorality, boy, is that a big umbrella, can even be garnered from the context of the 25 occurrences of the substantive porneia and the 7 occurrences of the verb porneo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there are 3 references: 1 to marital unfaithfulness in Matthew 5, 2 to sexual relations between unmarried people at 1 Corinthians 7, and 3 to homosexual relations as mentioned in Jude 7. But none of that stopped the God Squad in upstate New York from coming up with new light on sex. You know, the same sex that has been around since Adam and Eve, according to their beliefs. But Jesus apparently, for untold centuries, just wanted to keep clarification, definition, and all things sexual to himself until roughly the 1970s, when porneia pops on the scene and begins morphing and evolving into covering all kinds of sexual things. Any questions as to why Jesus delayed this understanding? Nah. Nope. Couldn't be 8 guys in New York changing the definition of a Greek word that they barely understand or have studied. It is unbelievable. In 1972, just looking at a timeline on all things sex obsession and porneia, in 1972, the definition of porneia was marital unfaithfulness. By 1973, homosexual actions were included. They just threw those in there. In addition to the 2 mentioned references, sexual relations between unmarried persons are included in porneia in the New Testament. Okay? So, in spite of the fact that the New Testament has no definition or specification, it doesn't unpack it. It doesn't give a laundry list of the different ways porneia can be performed between people. The governing body in 1974, this is all in print, made their own definitions of porneia. And not only that, but they applied these definitions to the marriages of Jehovah's Witnesses. Ah, yes, we are going to break down the absolute insanity surrounding oral sex and anal sex in a future episode. But needless to say, couples were able to divorce, families were destroyed, relationships were ended if either one of them wanted to use their mouths on the other person in the privacy of their own home or bedroom. No one else involved, but the governing body and the body of elders gets involved. What? What? This all came to fruition in 1974, but porneia and sex obsession just kept morphing. In 1986, they added sex with an animal was now part of porneia. In 1999, the meaning was extended to include the deliberate fondling of another person's sexual organs, as if there was another kind. I'm confused. And in 2019, they went straight crazy train. If a person is intimate with another person other than his or her spouse, this can constitute porneia even when both persons are fully clothed and there is no skin-to-skin contact. That's right. They made sure to cover the dangers of things like dry humping. Excuse the term if that offends you. Dry humping will be the subject of another episode down the road. So the governing body, with zero foundation and zero basis, completely changed the meaning of porneia. Sexual relations between married people and unmarried, despite the fact the Bible gives no details on this. Never mind, we're not going beyond the things written again, are we? Nope, we have a direct line to Jesus. And so sexuality and sex between married people was impacted. Now, I want to take a few minutes to read you what is currently in the Shepherd the Flock of God book. And I got to keep it brief because, as I mentioned, there were 7 pages of this. But on chapter 12, in the 3rd subsection, it talks about porneia, sexual immorality. And it has this to say, and again, it's not hard to get a copy of the Elder Handbook, folks. But it has this to say, just so you know directly what the governing body feels they have a right to legislate between 2 people, grown adults, consenting adults. It says, Section 3, sexual immorality or porneia. Porneia involves immoral use of the genitals, whether in a natural or in a perverted way with lewd intent. Natural or perverted? Seems pretty open-ended, right? There must have been another party to the immorality, a human of either sex or a beast. It includes adultery, bestiality, homosexuality, and prostitution. It also includes oral sex, anal sex, and manipulation of the genitals between individuals not married to each other. It is not a casual touching of the sex organs, but involves the manipulation of the genitals. I got so many questions on what's a casual touch. I was an elder. I had a question. Porneia does not require skin-to-skin contact, copulation, as in penetration, or sexual climax. Willing participation incurs guilt and requires judicial action. They can cut you off from your family. Subsection 1, immoral use of conveys the thought not just of touching, but of operating, manipulating, or employing something. For example, it is one thing to touch a musical instrument. It's something different to make use of a musical instrument. Where do we look? I'm going to hold myself accountable and not go off into joke land. Thank you for the musical instrument illustration, guys. You get an A. Section 2, lewd intent, identifies the motive. Interesting. We can read people's minds now. For example, a doctor may need to manipulate the genitals in examining a patient. A veterinarian, farmer, or rancher may do something similar to an animal. However, the intent is not sexual gratification. There are plenty of gynecologists who are relieved to hear they are not doomed to die at Armageddon. Subsection 3, manipulation, conveys the idea of operating something, whether by use of the hands or some other means. What? And does not require skin-to-skin contact. Momentary touching of another's genitals, even if intentional, would generally not be considered porneia. And in the 4th and 5th section, it mentions, thank God for this wisdom, masturbation of oneself is not porneia. And in 5, and this infuriates me, it says, one who was raped would not be guilty of porneia. Discernment is needed in considering claims of rape, taking into consideration such factors as the mental disposition of the person. What? The circumstances that led up to the incident and any delay in reporting. I'm not going to go there on number 5 because that deserves a full hour on how disturbing that is. Now listen, that's a snapshot of how people are educated on sex, and the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses and the governing body in particular, their complete obsession with defining every move. Everything you might do with your mouth, tongue, finger, hands, body parts, you name it. And listen, sexuality has long been the subject of jokes. It still is. And I'm having some fun with this subject because it gets me through it. We laugh. We make a few jokes. But truthfully, this subject really isn't funny. It really isn't. We do our best to get through it when we discuss it. But Jehovah's Witnesses have taken something completely natural and turned it into something bizarre, unnatural, weird, scary, trying to discern someone's motives between two consenting adults that are attracted to each other and want to enjoy private time together. At what point or where is there any direction in the Bible available to the entire planet that looks anything like this? It says, people should be married, whether you agree with that or not is up to you. And if people who are married go outside the marriage, that's fornication. But not according to the governing body, who now gets into animals, gay people, how we touch, whether we have clothes on when we touch, what our tongues do and our mouths do. You name it, they're in full control of the narrative to Jehovah's Witnesses. And folks, it isn't funny. All joking aside, it has damaged millions of people. Millions. If nothing else, it's given them a distorted view of sex. It's created endless guilt, shame. As we'll see in future episodes, it's caused terrible marriages between people who are too young to be married just because they're just so horny and they just want to be with someone they're attracted to. It's broken up families. It's created lifelong stigmas around something that is created and comes naturally, something that's beautiful. By comparison, and these are my comparisons, imagine devoting this much time to how you eat, which side of the mouth we chew on, how a fork enters our mouth. Should we have used a spoon instead? Is that a sin? How much is too much licking? Imagine devoting this much time to how we bathe. Do you do the shampoo first or suds up first? Do I use a bar of soap or liquid soap? Are shower caps acceptable covering my God-given hair? Can I wash my genitals for 5 seconds, or is 20 seconds too long? Yeah, I'm being sarcastic, but sex falls right in that category. Eating, bathing, living, breathing. It's part of the natural human experience. It's supposed to be beautiful, it's supposed to enjoy it, it's supposed to feel great about it. It's a wonderful thing between two consenting adults. But the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses has literally ruined lives on this subject of sex. They have literally invited themselves into the relationships of two consenting adults. They've invited themselves to sit at the foot of your bed in your bedroom to check on what positions you're using, how you're using your mouth, and to counsel you on any dirty talk you might be saying. It's incredible. It's absurd. It's humiliating. To me, it's infuriating because it goes to control. And it has created generations of broken relationships and dysfunctional guilt surrounding something that is supposed to be beautiful. All mammals do it. They do it. They procreate. And it's highly enjoyable for human beings. Now, joke, insert a joke, maybe not always. Right? Yeah, but that's part of the experience, isn't it? To experiment, to find someone you enjoy being with, that you enjoy doing it with, where your sexual appetites match up. And I'll tell you, and I'll leave the seriousness with this thought, and we're going to tackle it in the future, but people, anyone listening, please note, people have taken their lives over this stuff. They've killed themselves over guilt, shame, or being lonely, or being a virgin by a certain age, or masturbation, self-pleasure, something that science has seen fetuses doing in the womb. It's an endless diet of fear for Jehovah's Witnesses. I've mentioned that almost all their counsel leads back to sex, how you dress, how you groom, how you smile, the length of your skirt, what your blouse is showing, how tight your pants are, the music you listen to, dancing, association, what you're doing in the workplace, on and on and on. It all goes back to sex and their gross obsession with it, as if it's oxygen, when it's just one component of the human experience. And I want to finish up by sharing this one, although it probably deserves its entire own episode. But for those of us that grew up Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course, if you're a witness, you cannot be gay. So that's a subject for another day. But for between a boy and a girl, a man and a woman, you could not date without a chaperone. Oh boy, should we talk about chaperones? Grown adults can't date without a third person present. Grown adults. Why? Because guess what? If you're alone with someone, your underwear and panties are going to hit the floor and you're going to turn into rabbits. That's just what the governing body believes. That's what they believe. Everything comes back to sex. Chaperones were an integral part of the 80s dating scene among Jehovah's Witnesses. Why? Not because it's cool to have your best friend along, but because, we might have sex. So you can't date without chaperones if you're a teenager or adult. And get this, to what extent was it important to realize you can't be alone if you're a man or woman because you just can't control yourself? A couple of references in closing. The Kingdom Ministry of September 1997, page 3, under the announcements. The May 1997, quote, the May 1997 Our Kingdom Ministry question box recommended that we be cautious about working in the ministry with publishers of the opposite sex. There are good reasons for all to use good judgment in this matter. This does not mean that traveling overseers or even other brothers cannot work in the field ministry with sisters. Rather, the thought was expressed that it is not wise for a brother to be spending time regularly alone with the same person of the opposite sex to whom he is not related. End quote. Why? Because they might like each other, because they might hit it off, they might talk about their favorite TV show, and oh my God, they're in the ministry. They might actually start a Bible study together? No, because they might get busy right there in the field service. They might have sex. That's what it's about. And if you think it's just about the normal publishers, get this delightful warning from the Watchtower of 1993, February 15th, page 15, paragraph. Oh my God, I just went Elmer Fudd there. Paragraph 12. Look who gets included in the counsel about men and women can't handle themselves. Quote, in developed countries, some have fallen into Satan's trap by often being with a member of the opposite sex and without a third person present, such as regularly being in the confined intimacy of a car for driving lessons. Elders doing shepherding calls also need to exercise caution so as not to be alone with a sister when counseling her. Conversations can become emotionally charged and result in an embarrassing situation for both parties. End quote. No one's safe, people. Even a shepherd, of course, appointed by Holy Spirit, remember, can fall to the evil wiles of a beautiful woman. Because, you know, Jesus was never able to have a conversation with a woman by himself. He had to have a chaperone. All of this leads back to sex obsession. Look, I'm not naive. Sexual attraction is strong. It's also normal. It's even beautiful. And I really believe that. It is part of our great experience on this planet. And when you're this repressed, you may just skip the return visit and park the car and maul each other. Sure, it could happen. I'm not naive to that. But you have to ask that with this amount of obsession and repression, have the governing body actually caused their own problems? Do they cause some of this crazy sexual tension? Personally, I think they have. And honestly, I don't blame people. I sat on so many judicial committees, I lost track. I can't tell you how many. There's too many. And as I mentioned, 90% were about sex, including the damage done by endless shaming in marriages, even in dating. Or in my case, I never dealt with a woman who was gay, but I had several brothers who came forward as gay. I even had a brother who went too far at massage parlors. Okay. Yeah. All of it. I'm not naive to the power of sex. It's a powerful thing. It's why the world seems to be drenched in it. Okay. But to literally build an entire foundation, talks, conventions under endless negative messaging surrounding something that's supposed to be beautiful and wonderful has not in the least caused people to stop fornicating or married people to stop enjoying their mate who they love and adore and are attracted to. It hasn't stopped it. So what was the point? What was the point? So as you can see, we dove into the deep end a little bit on sexuality. We went macro level in this episode of Surviving Paradise, and there's so much more to discuss on the subject of Jehovah's Witnesses and sex. So as I mentioned at the outset, I fear that I'm subconsciously creating a symposium format for this subject. You know, I won't send out the schedule for the Saturday morning symposium on Jehovah's Witness obsession, with sex. My voice is changing. Puberty all over again. But we will need to unpack more of the details surrounding this subject. For example, dating. It deserves its own special spotlight. homosexuality, being a gay person, and all of the horrific things they've said right up to this district convention, in my opinion, which is hate speech. It's deadly, it's evil, and it's a full-on assault to gay people. And I am disgusted by it. We're going to talk about that. I would be remiss if we did not handle the sensitive subject of masturbation and the Bethel Pillowgate instructional video to Bethelites, who some activists have done a phenomenal job online. You must go see those because you won't believe it. Prepare for your jaw to drop. Telling us how to sleep or how to touch a pillow. Yes, a pillow. And how sisters just breathing constantly, you're turning us brothers on. So you're truly evil creatures. Literally, women get blamed for everything in this religion. Everything. They can't even be cute, because if we notice they're cute, it's their fault. It's their fault. We're going to talk about the highly sensitive subject. I decided not to go there in this episode, of oral and anal sex. And this one is huge because it, for a time, was a disfellowshipping offense. It wrecked relationships, destroyed marriages and families, led to divorces, and is just an unbelievable evidence of the confusion the 8 guys must have when they talk to Jesus, because he just couldn't get it straight on this issue. And in fact, he didn't comment on it at all in the Bible. Guess it wasn't as important enough. So he left it up to these 8 guys to tell us what's what. So friends, thanks again for joining me on this episode. It was a long one, but of course, what did you expect? Jehovah's Witnesses are absolutely, and particularly leadership, are absolutely obsessed with the subject of sex, fornication, adultery, masturbation, homosexuality. They are obsessed with it. So we will tackle some of those subjects in greater detail as we take a walk through the spiritual paradise of Jehovah's Witnesses in future episodes. But please, if you take nothing away from this week, know that this is a wonderful part of our lives. Hopefully it's good for all of us. I wish good sex for everyone. I hope that's not too bold. And it is nothing to be ashamed of. It is certainly nothing to feel guilty about desiring. It has literally been overblown, almost like how we chew our food, how we sleep, or anything else that comes natural to the human experience. So thanks again to everyone. I look forward to the comments on this one. I've had to be very careful. Obviously, I guess this one will certainly be considered explicit because of the subject matter, but I look forward to your comments, and I can't wait and thoroughly enjoy some of the notes I'm getting in DMs, on the Twitter handle, on YouTube. Keep them coming. We're going to tackle some of these, and I warned you, we're going to go straight symposium style probably in the next couple episodes as we take a deep dive look and just get it out of the way. Let's just get it out of the way on this subject of sex among Jehovah's Witnesses. Thanks again. We appreciate you liking, subscribing, and all the communication. Have a fantastic week, and we will see you again next week here on Surviving Paradise. Be well.